Hello, welcome to the Third Rail podcast. We got a little bit different type of episode coming your way today, but excited to test this out. Normally, we like discussing some current events, recent developments in public transit, but this week we're going to look at one city's transit system in particular and discuss what they do well and maybe some areas for improvement. If you stay tuned, there'll be quite a few areas of improvement here. But before we dive in, how are you doing today, Owen?
I'm good, Adam. I'm glad to be back and very excited to talk about Denver.
Yeah, so you spoiled the surprise there. The city we will be focusing on is Denver, Colorado. No, it's all good. People were going to find out. It's probably in the thumbnail, to be honest. So
True.
I don't know what I'm talking about with surprise. But Denver, Colorado is where I live. I live in suburban Denver. And Owen was very gracious and came out to visit me 2 weeks ago. And we figured that he was only here for a couple of days, but got to experience a pretty decent amount of public transit while in town. So might as well dive on in and see your initial thoughts. Do you have,
great.
As someone, let me make sure I'm correct. Was this your very first time visiting Colorado?
Well, that's tough. It was a great trip, by the way. Thank you for being such a good host. I have technically been in the state of Colorado 2 times prior. One time I spent a night in the Denver airport because Frontier gave me a fare low enough that I was okay sleeping on the floor of that airport. And the other time was driving through on a road trip last year after I graduated. So I have seen some of the state of Colorado out of a window of either an airplane or a car. But this was my first time experiencing it, both riding the transit, also just getting outside and exploring everything that the state has to offer, which is both a great city and urban environment in Denver and then beautiful, beautiful nature. It's a really nice combination.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't count if you don't leave TSA. I think that doesn't necessarily count.
I agree.
Entering this state.
I know.
But I'm sure you got to see a lot on your drive-through. But I guess, do you have any initial thoughts on public transit in Denver and Colorado?
Well, yeah, in Denver, this was my first time riding the system. And so the full disclosure I'll give is I did at least one of every mode. We together rode the bus, we took the light rail, and then I tried the commuter rail, or more like regional rail, to the airport. And I was generally pretty impressed with the system, considering that nearly all of it is new build. This isn't some legacy holdover from the early 1900s. I can see that there's been a lot of careful planning involved in the system, and I know how difficult it can be to build a comprehensive network, which is something that I think Denver is on the verge of. It's hard to say that this city, the system in Denver, the RTD, competes with the legacy systems you see in New York or Chicago or maybe a new build like in Washington, D.C. It's not quite there, but I think it's a really great system, and it does a pretty good job of getting you from where you are to where you want to be. That was my general takeaway.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. For me, I don't know if I would necessarily want to compare it to New York or Philly or Chicago or DC or even San Fran, just in terms of size. Don't get me wrong, Denver's a big city. It's the hub of the Front Range. It's really the only big metropolitan area in any direction for hundreds of miles. Mm-hmm. But it's not on the scale of New York. It's, I think, the 18th or 19th biggest metro area in the U.S. So I think a more apt comparison would be Tampa. I think maybe Seattle would be in a range, San Diego, Minneapolis. And when you compare it against those cities, I think it fares pretty well, if not among the higher end of its sort of peer group, if that's how we want to think about it.
I agree. That's a good way to frame it. I think I got caught up there in trying to compare it to legacy versus new build system, because all of those cities you just mentioned, they are all new builds. So I guess the point I'm trying to get across was that it didn't have the connectivity of a city that was built with public transit in mind as the city grew. I know that Denver continues to grow. It's been incredibly high growth over the past 30 years, but that core, that downtown core, Union Station existed, but all of this, the commuter rail, the light rail, all of that was added to the urban fabric and has helped the city expand. I agree. I think in the city classes that you were talking about, the only one you mentioned that I would give a higher rating to, based on my experience, is probably Seattle. So yeah, Denver's definitely punching above its weight, especially with its American peers.
Yeah, let's dive on into some of the modes you mentioned. I guess commuter rail's probably a good of place of any to begin. For me, as someone who did not grow up here, I didn't realize how new the entire commuter rail network is. The very first line opened less than 10 years ago. And now there's 4 lines, it's sprawling, it's several dozen miles of track. And it's honestly, I know we've been calling it commuter rail, but they run pretty solid frequencies on all lines in all directions at all times of day. To me, it's obviously not rapid transit. You can't go to a platform and expect a train in like 6 minutes, 8 minutes, like you might on the DC Metro, like you might on the New York subway or Boston or Philly or something. But it's not the commuter rail in the traditional sense where you get on one train in the morning headed to downtown, and then get on another train in the evening headed out to the suburbs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely, it's not as much of a commuter system like you're saying. I really liked how it was more of a regional connector. My experience was only with the A line, which serves the airport and Union Station and stops in between. But during the day, those trains run every 15 minutes. They are electric multiple unit trains, so EMU. I got to stop saying commuter rail. It's regional rail. But every 15 minutes is about as good as it gets in the world of commuter rail / regional rail.
Yeah,
and
I'm thinking some rapid lines are about at that. You look at some of the spur lines in DC or Miami or Atlanta or San Fran. Those have at some times a day 4 trains an hour.
And the line, I mean, it's pretty excellent service also for what it does. Speaking to this line and what I observed outside of it, there's definitely improvements that could be made. The biggest is density around the stations. Transit-oriented development is lacking in a lot of cases. And the line is clearly there to shuttle people between the ever-growing Denver airport, which continues to expand, and downtown. That is enough of a use case alone, in my book, for the line to exist, to getting cars off the highway, getting people downtown. It's an affordable way to do so. But you have 6 stops in between the airport and Union Station in downtown Denver, and I'd like to see a little bit more density, especially on the stops that are closer to the downtown Denver core, simply because there's high demand to live in the city, and trains that come every 15 minutes, like we said, it's not quite heavy rail frequencies, but it's pretty darn close.
Yeah, those 6 stations, all of them are park and ride, anywhere from 200 to 1.5 grand, 1,500 spaces. So I think they were designed with a very specific purpose in mind. But I do have to say it's still relatively new. It's a 10-year-old system. Obviously, you'd like to see some more density, some more transit accessibility, transit-oriented development. Mm-hmm. But that takes time, and that line in particular was made as a shuttle. The stops in between the airport and downtown were a nice to have, not necessarily the focus. So that doesn't mean they can't go back, and now that it's built, focus on trying to get as best out of it as you can. That would obviously make the most sense. But with a line that's a decade old at this point, you can't be... I personally am not too disappointed in that aspect of it.
Now, my understanding was that the other regional rail lines may have 30-minute frequencies. I think it depends on the line. There is a little bit of interlining there as well. But generally, it seemed to be a very positive, high-frequency line. And I mean, I took the A line probably in the middle of the day around lunch, and the airport was clearly the thing driving ridership. Not nearly everyone in the car got off at the airport. There were some people at the intermediate stops, but I could see that the airport, being such a busy hub for so many different airlines that are departing at all times of day and night, that was driving traffic outside of the typical commuting hours, which is a really important thing on any transit system. And like you said, that justifies the line alone to me.
Yeah, there's 4 regional lines. They call them commuter, but again, you could argue semantically how to best classify it. Mm-hmm. But it's pretty unique because they all point towards the north side of the metro area.
Yeah.
And they all terminate at Union Station, and they have platforms right next to each other. And it's a pretty great hub. We could discuss this later when we talk about buses and whatnot. But Amtrak stops there, and then you get the regional rail and the light rails nearby and the bus. So that's a very nice hub. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the commuter rail service, do you think that's something that should be expanded further? Do you think maybe a focus should be taking what's been built and adding in development and increasing ridership on that end?
It's hard to say because regional rail in its nature, when we talk about expanding it, that typically means expanding it further out of the city. And I'm not an expert on Denver. My opinions are based on my experiences. I'm not sure what type of growth is happening outside of the city, but I still saw room for growth inside of the city. So instead of looking outwards, now that they've established these lines, and most importantly have high frequency service between the airport and downtown, I would like to see something that better serves the city itself, makes it so that you are less reliant on a car within the city of Denver. You hinted at us talking about Union Station as a hub. I'm happy to wait if you want to, but
no, let's dive in. That's a good segue.
That was just one of those things that I noticed, and I don't have the full background or the history, and I know how expensive these projects are. And Union Station existed before any of this transit ended up making its way to Denver. Union Station was built as a terminal, and that's the way it works. And I wonder if that's a missed opportunity to kind of reimagine the network, where these trains dead end at Union Station, but perhaps they should have looked into, and they very well may have, and just determined it's too expensive through running, because some through running through Union Station might create an opportunity to better serve not only the city, because you could add some stations before and after Union Station, but then people who are commuting or taking the train in and out of the suburbs served by the N, B, and G lines, whereas the frequencies might be a little bit lower. If they're coming from the airport, they don't want to transfer at Union Station. If the train ran through, it might be an easier, smoother ride, easier to convince a choice rider to take the train. So that's low-hanging fruit, and my guess is that the benefits, according to studies, just did not justify the extreme expense of converting Union Station from a terminal to a through running stop. But that was one thing I observed when taking a look at the system, was that both the regional rail and the light rail terminated at Union Station.
Yeah, I think the regional rail would be a lot trickier to modify. As I mentioned, all 4 lines are kind of parallel platforms there, and then they fan out in the northern direction.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that's just based on the layout of this historic station right downtown, right by all the sports stadiums and apartments and restaurants and nightlife and all that, which is great. But it kind of confines what could be constructed south of the station. When, on the other hand, the light rail, it doesn't directly terminate at the historic station building. It's a couple blocks down, and it's street running for a bit, and it goes southward through that way. So I think that could maybe be expanded northwards, and you could have through running on the light rail lines. That would probably be a better approach. But in all, like, given the circumstances, and you could tell that it's retrofitted, transit was not top of mind when Union Station was built, obviously, and when the downtown core really was built up. But they managed to, at least in my opinion, turn things into a pretty decent main hub for transit all throughout the region. You have the Amtrak and commuter rail have platforms right by the historic station. Then 2 blocks down, you have the light rail platform, where I don't believe every light rail line terminates, but I think
No.
3 of them. So
Yep.
3 of the 5 terminate there. So a good number. And then connecting them, you have an underground bus terminal, and it's enclosed and heated and AC'd in the winter and summer, and there's a bathroom, although we had some issues with that when we visited. But they have city buses, they have commuter buses, they have intercity buses, they have the Greyhound, they have the Bustang. Bustang, for those listening, that's like the Colorado Department of Transportation's branded intercity line. So if you want to go, I don't know, to Aspen from Denver, you want to go to Fort Morgan, you could take one of those lines.
I kind of dig that
there.
name.
Yeah, it works out and it's branded pretty well, but most of the lines terminate at Union Station as well in that underground bus arcade. A couple of them have supplemental stops in the suburbs, depending on which highway and direction it's headed. But in total, it makes Union Station a pretty great place to access transit. It's a bit tough, like any hub and spokes modeled system. If you live on one of the spokes and want to get to another spoke, it might require a transfer in a circuitous route. You can't necessarily go direct, but I feel like, again, Denver, it's not New York, it's not Chicago. For a city of Denver's population and the way the region is developed, I think that's fine.
I'm mostly with you. Yeah, it's hard not to want the very best. Sometimes you have to settle for good, and I think that is, in some ways, what happens here. I go back and forth between the fact that Denver is a city of a lot of recent development, and there's 2 different arguments you can make here. It's that Denver has seen a lot of the growth that the Sun Belt has, and it doesn't look like the Sun Belt. There is transit. It's theoretically possible to live without a car and not hate your existence, and that's huge. I'm so thrilled to see that, and they've invested a lot of money to make that life possible. The other point, though, is that Denver is still a city dominated by the car, and I know that you live out in the suburbs, Adam, and we'll get to you. I actually was pretty impressed with the transit access in your case. But in the city core, I still see a lot of car-oriented development, and then that's inevitable. But I think in that downtown core, they could make it easier to live without a car, and that might include newer projects. I mean, they're rebuilding some of the downtown rail. There's a loop of sorts where some of the other light rail lines terminate, which I'm a fan of. Unfortunately, I didn't get to explore it. But I think that there's highways cutting through the city. It's very easy to get into the city via car. And the hub and spoke, like you mentioned, it does get the job done, but it's not competitive with driving if you're trying to go from one spoke to a different spoke on another line, which isn't the design intention. I understand that. The goal of this system was to get you into the city. But it's unfortunate, especially in a region that, while not the Sun Belt, is a little sprawling.
While you were in town, you had the opportunity to ride the light rail as well.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any thoughts on your experience taking that? I know you only took it for a couple of miles, but you got to feel out the system a bit.
Yeah, I enjoyed the light rail. I thought it was a pretty solid system. They've built it where the people are in a lot of cases. There's service at the University of Denver. That's huge. And that's actually where I boarded. We took it from the University of Denver station down to Union Station. So that is, by a quick count, at least 8 stops to downtown. So it was a pretty good experience. There's some interlining. So there's multiple lines, at least on this corridor. One would go to Union Station, another would go to that downtown loop and then circle back out. And so if you are flexible, those frequencies can be pretty solid, especially during peak times. I think trains might come as often as 5 minutes or perhaps even lower. In our case, it was probably the early afternoon, and each line was running every 10 minutes. So we had trains every 5 minutes, which was pretty solid. That said, our destination was Union Station. That's where we wanted to be. So that made our true frequency every 10 minutes. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a terrible frequency. But if you are traveling in the period of the line where there's interlining, that doubles your frequency to trains every 5 minutes. That is really, really solid. I enjoyed the ride. It was smooth, pretty fast, and it was quite crowded because this would have been a Saturday, I think, Adam, when we were riding. We were heading to a Rockies game, which was a lot of fun, but Morgan Wallen was also performing at Mile High Field, so the train was packed. And it did leave me wondering what that train would look like on a weekday, because the final 3 stops are Mile High Field, then the Ball Arena stop, and then Union Station. So it did feel like this service, in the same way that the A line is built to serve the airport, this was built to serve those downtown arenas. And I have no issue with transit that is designed to service those events, but my view of the system was kind of colored by the fact that the train was packed because there was a lot going on. I'd love to see what it looks like on a typical workday.
Yeah, are you concerned at all by the street running, by the unseparated grade?
In my limited experience on our line, there was minimal street running. There were at-grade crossings, but I did see crossing arms. So I don't really have an issue with that as long as there's signal priority. I don't think I saw the full extent of the street running, so it's hard for me to comment on that, unfortunately. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I think for the type of service it is, it's probably fine. For the longer lines, they have separate guideways, but do have grade crossings on some instances. That segment between, I guess, what would that be? Between Mile High and the university where you got on, that's pretty completely separated. It follows a highway and is able to go without stopping. So that's nice. In terms of light rail, I know it varies across the country, but this line, this segment, Most of the network is pretty decent in terms of that respect.
I think, again, kind of going back to our earlier comparison, I would place the light rail system below the Seattle light rail system, which we could have a full discussion about, and we've talked about them before. That should probably all be heavy rail in Seattle. So I'd place this below Seattle, but above most of its peer competitors, including the Twin Cities, whose system I have taken some time to explore.
You mentioned earlier that you think the commuter rail should probably be kept as is and more focus on the city itself. Do you think light rail would be a good mode for expanding downtown service, or would you like more buses, or what did you have in mind when you were thinking that?
I think that I don't think that there's a single fix. I think the system that we saw, and I appreciate this format, Adam, but I want to hear more from you too, because you're the one who actually lives there. But just what I saw, I think everything is in a good spot, and certain enhancements could make things great. I appreciated the bus system. The commuter rail ride to the airport was excellent. But as I've mentioned a few times, there are parts of that downtown core that have bus routes that are pretty infrequent. So if you aren't trying to go somewhere that is served by the light rail right now or a high-frequency bus, you might be out of luck in trying to live that car-free lifestyle. So I love the bones in Denver. I think small tweaks to service, new services, and then more transit-oriented development will really bring about good change for that system. One reason... go ahead.
I'm going to queue up the next topic, so if you have any last thoughts here.
I guess the last thing just was... I am in transit, it is more important that it be built than it be perfect. We've seen time and again systems that would be so useful today were cut in the 80s or 90s because it wasn't useful enough or it cost too much. So just build it and then work to make it better. That is my philosophy. But in that vein, a lot of the light rail lines and all of the bus express corridors are along the freeway, and that can make development hard. So I'd like to see them work to develop in those tougher spaces. The tracks exist. Even if it's next to a freeway, there's ways to make that a desirable place to live. But that has been a hamper to some TOD, it seems.
Yeah, I think that is a great summary of the state of the system in 2026. The bones are there, the foundation's there. It's just putting some muscle on that. Mm-hmm. But I guess the final part of this transit network, transit ecosystem, is buses, and we mentioned buses briefly on a couple of occasions earlier in this episode. But buses could be a good service to help fill in where either rail would take too long to build or the demand quite isn't there. You want to supplement it. Denver's unique. They have both regular city buses going to traditional arterial routes that you'd expect for like city and regional buses to do. But then there's also a couple of longer commuter buses, and that's something that we were able to ride. In particular, they have the Flatiron Flyer, which connects downtown Denver to downtown Boulder, which is northwest of town, and that's where the University of Colorado is located. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty impressed with that system. When it was built, it was kind of billed as a BRT, and I think that's a little generous, to put it politely. But it's good for what it is. It basically follows U.S. Highway 36, which is a pretty solid controlled access freeway from Denver to Boulder. And since it was built, a lot of office and residential communities kind of sprung up on that thoroughfare. And this bus line, it doesn't even really get off the highway. They constructed bus stations, I guess bus stops, depending on how you want to define it, in the slip lane. So the buses kind of pull over, let people on and off, but it doesn't really exit the highway at all. And that could make it pretty quick for a bus system of its size and distance and whatnot, getting people to and from downtown in a relatively quick fashion. I'm pretty impressed with that.
Yeah, that was the service that was most convenient for where you live. And I really enjoyed using it. I want to say the frequencies were 20 minutes, at least during the weekdays at peak, which is great service for something that is technically intercity, going between Boulder and Denver. I would call that an intercity service. It's more of a commuter bus, like you said. But every 20 minutes does not meet my standard or a general standard for bus rapid transit. And I think that's probably a pretty fair critique. I would not call it
and
bus
not
rapid.
only that, it doesn't have isolated lanes. It has they built actual stops rather than just have a flag on this side of the street. So kudos to them. But it rides on the highway. It's not separated by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. I was broadly pretty impressed with it, though. The fare is very low. I want to say it was, probably $2.50 per way. It's $5 for a day pass, unless you're going to the airport when it's a $10 pass. And that was pretty excellent, considering what it serves, which is Denver, the stops in kind of broadly the suburbs along the way between Denver and Boulder. And then Boulder, which, of course, is home to CU Boulder. So this line carries a lot of students, a lot of Boulder residents who might work in Denver. I was quite pleased by the bus system. The closest comparison I had to it was a service when I was a student at Michigan, the kind of combo, it's called the Michigan Flyer and the D2A2. It's intercity buses. One goes to the airport, one goes from Ann Arbor to Detroit, and it runs every hour. I was grateful that it existed because it could get me to downtown Detroit without needing a car, and that was very cool. But it was express, which is perfect if you live in Ann Arbor and you want to get to Detroit, and that was my case. But it leaves a lot of people out of the coverage zone, and I've kind of gone back and forth on this because, Adam, as you mentioned, development has sprung up along the route. I wouldn't, and I don't mean to kind of inherently be critiquing your place. I loved where you are. I thought it was really cool. But your development isn't necessarily transit-oriented development. I feel like it is in many ways still car-oriented, just along a transit line. And so it's super cool that you have the option for the bus, but I'm not sure it spurred development the way that a train away from a freeway might. Do you agree?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the option's definitely there, but these type of communities and these type of riders, you're not going to get people like New York City where they take the subway to the grocery, they take the subway to the daycare, they take the subway to the sports game and the ballet and whatever. You'll get people who might take it every once in a while to the airport, who might take it every once in a while if they're going to see a comedy show downtown, going to see a football game up in Boulder. You get a lot of university students taking this who might not have a car or might be from out of state but want to go to downtown. So in that sense, it's a very good route. And I think the headways are actually more forgiving for the type of use case this is. Mm-hmm. You're not taking... most riders, not everyone, but most riders aren't taking this daily to and from work. They'll take this downtown to Denver to see a Rockies game. They'll take this up to Boulder to visit a friend or go to some nightlife up there. And in that case, you're a little bit more forgiving to have 20-minute headways or 30-minute headways or whatever it may be, because, it's a little bit infrequent. You'll plan around that trip. you'll make it's not a spontaneous trip is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So like, of course, in an ideal world, you'd like buses every 20 seconds, but with limitations, I think it works out fine. That corridor from Denver to Boulder, it has a string of suburbs. You got Westminster, where I'm living. You have Broomfield, which is a very nice community. You have Louisville, and then you have Superior, all kind of in a row there. And they all sprung up around this toll road, which was built in like the 50s, connecting these two towns. And it honestly reminds me a lot of the Silver Line corridor, the Dulles Airport corridor in Northern Virginia, where you have kind of an anchor at the end of the corridor. Here it's Boulder, the university town. There it's the Dulles Airport. And along the way, you've got in a lot of recent development some decent enough density for what it is. And you get a lot of companies and mixed use, and a lot of tech and industrial companies have kind of sprung up along both the US 36 and the Dulles Toll Road corridor. So I don't know. I guess DC had the metro system in place that made extending it. They had the whole infrastructure already in rail yards and an existing network that they could kind of piggyback on. But I don't know, maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, I could see this corridor supporting rail transit. I know that's in the long-range plan, and when I say long-range, I mean like 20 years. I think 2042 is what they say, to extend one of the commuter rail lines up to Boulder, and then I think even go further to Longmont, which is even further beyond Boulder. Based on the development that's grown up and the amount of ridership that this bus line has, I don't think that's necessarily a bad idea. Obviously, the question becomes how much CapEx will you need to do? Could you piggyback off of an existing right-of-way or an existing track even, or would you have to kind of construct your own? But ideally, I think this could be fruitful soil for a future rail line.
I agree, and it is logical to connect Boulder, the city, by rail. I think, we want to avoid the trains good, buses bad conundrum that some transit enthusiasts fall into, but in this case, the bus has a few very distinct downsides, one of which is just capacity. I think the bus service is excellent, but we saw after the Rockies game that you and I went to with some friends, the bus was full, and it can only seat so many people. A train immediately solves that problem. And then the stops.
Not only I've had to wait for next buses that have been too full. It pulls up, and on the big banner it says "bus full, use next bus," and that's okay. It's not okay in any case, but it's understandable if you're waiting 3 minutes for the next subway train. If you're waiting 20 or 30 minutes for the next bus on a weekend, that's really unacceptable.
Yeah, that's the last time a choice rider will use the service. That's for sure. I think the other advantage of rail transit is that, at least in the current way this bus service was designed, which I didn't hate, the dedicated stops on exits and then the bus would just get back on the freeway. But it means that the bus has to hit a light every time it wants to stop. So in addition to the stop, there's a light. And rail transit, especially if it's commuter rail, because commuter rail will always have signal priority through at-grade crossings, it eliminates those extra stops. And then finally, the most logical is that this bus without dedicated right-of-way gets stuck in traffic when there is traffic. And a commuter rail would offer a much more predictable ride time. No traffic, construction won't get in the way. I think that there are definitely the logical benefits there, and then the cap at the end of the route being Boulder, it definitely warrants a rail connection. But I would hope, should they turn this into commuter rail, that they do it right the way they did with the airport. Electrify the thing so the trains can accelerate at high speeds and then run frequencies that are like the A-line. Every 15 minutes is something that I'd really like to see.
Yeah, I think it would be an extension of the B line, which terminates in like historic Westminster, which frankly isn't even that far from downtown. I think it's like 4 miles from downtown. Eventually, it's planning to be a 41-mile high capacity route all the way to Longmont, with stops in Westminster, Broomfield, Louisville, Boulder on the way. I think in the long term that could be a really high usage route, but it all depends on implementation. I feel like that's a theme of our podcast is some ideas might be good in the right circumstances, but you got to implement it right.
I agree. And it's very tough, right? I go back and forth on it. I just said good transit is better than transit that doesn't exist. You can't let perfection be the enemy of good. But at the same time, when you're going to spend this much money, you want to do it right. Anyone who's ever taken heavy rail knows that you're better off underground or elevated than in highway median. It is nearly always a worse experience waiting for a train stuck in a highway median. But then again, if the alternative is no train, I guess I'd rather be in a highway median. So I'll be interested to watch how this plays out. This definitely feels like a line that could be converted. But in the meantime, I had a great experience riding the bus. I loved that they were coaches. Still handicap accessible despite the fact that there are steps up because there was a wheelchair lift on board the bus. The seats were comfortable.
I've seen people use it. People do use the accessibility features.
Yeah, and that's super important. So I'm glad they exist. But overall, a great ride. I had a great experience with that bus.
Yeah, so we've touched on all three modes of transit they got in Denver. I guess the last thing I wanted to touch on is the governance of this, and you probably aren't super familiar with
I'm not.
how it's run just being a passenger, and sometimes that's for the best, because if you're aware of governance, it's usually a bad thing. But it's pretty unique. You got this, the network, the operators called the RTD, which stands for Regional Transportation District, and it has composes of 6 counties in the metro area, which is pretty widespread. So I found it pretty unique. You go all the way up to Boulder, you go to even Weld County. They have RTD buses up there, and they don't have separate bus networks. So I guess that's the pro, is that you have one operator serving the whole region and able to plan regionally and not have overlap, but also not have any gaps or blind spots and have good connectivity there. So I think that's a big win of them. Same thing with the rail transit, these rail lines. Denver's suburbs are very fragmented with municipalities. You have several dozen small cities kind of dotting the landscape like puzzle pieces. So kind of having, rather than having independent systems in each one or in each county even, having one unified system is pretty envious and not something that a lot of cities could say. Even, I don't know, looking at New York, you leave the city itself, there's other bus systems. It's really bad in DC, which I'm familiar with. There's like 12 different bus operators in the area because each county wants their own system to serve their own interests. And you have overlap and you have gaps and poor connectivity and you lose some synergy. I guess the downside of the governance is it is publicly elected. So what they do, they split up the service territory into, I think, 16 different districts. Mm-hmm. And each district has a representative that's publicly elected. And I don't know, in my theory, I don't think that's a really great way to operate and govern a transit system. It's nice to have some direct accountability to voters and riders and the public. But on the other hand, these are just people, and they don't have any direct connections with the state government or local government, who are necessary stakeholders for planning, necessary stakeholders for funding. And they have a very similar framework in San Francisco for the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, where they have different representatives who represent different constituencies. And I don't know, I find it could be very parochial. You might have people not thinking about the best interests of the region or the best interests of the entire system, but just thinking about what serves their individual voters best. And in maybe a steelman case, that could be a good thing if every representative is super responsive to the public and their constituents, but they often aren't. These are just kind of cushy elected positions for people to run. You don't see super committed people running for this often, and they don't always have transit riders in the front of mind. Sometimes it's other interests that they come to. So not to say I've had any specific grievances with specific members of the RTD board. Frankly, I don't know too much about them. That's probably for the best. You want anonymity and just competency. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on how it should be governed?
It's hard to say because, as is federalism, we see different governance systems around the country, and there's ways to critique all of them. I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with this, but it is notable that throughout much of the country, the more democratic a system is, and that doesn't have to be a board of governance, it just means how you get to interact with the system, the planning process, the less seems to get done. We see that in California high-speed rail, where individual action has been a very strong deterrent of construction in California. Individuals have sued, they've weaponized environmental reviews. The democratic process has been used in a way to stop the building of something that is for the greater good. And we see that across the country. So it's very tricky because these are community-based systems. You must serve the community in the best interest of the community. But when you choose a democratically elected board, the way you were talking about, it can sometimes mean that despite giving voters that choice, their best interests aren't necessarily actually being represented.
Yeah, I think, to say your point, I fully agree. Sometimes to get transit built, you need a Robert Moses who goes out there and
because he did such a great job.
No, not for transit, but he built stuff. He left his mark. Say what you will about him, he's still impacting the city well beyond the grave.
That's true.
My personal transit hero is kind of in the same mold. Is Jackson Graham, who was the first director of the DC Metro, and I'm fully convinced that the system would not be built in his absence. We'll talk about him particularly maybe in an episode of his own, but he had once he got marching orders for what lines and stations should be built, he was a bulldozer, and he got the system built, and I think a weaker-willed leader probably would not have been able to accomplish that.
It couldn't be better said myself. I don't have a specific transit hero right now. I'll do some research and I'll get back to you. But
we'll do that. That'll be an episode. We'll each have transit heroes.
I think we'll have to do an episode on the construction process because I go back and forth in the sense that, like, high-speed rail, California high-speed rail, for example, is such an imperative. You've poured so much money into this, and climate change is such a looming issue that, to me, you should just build the thing, right? We should waive some of these regulations and reviews. We should limit people's ability to sue to stop it. But these reviews, these public processes, they exist because in the 40s and 50s, highways were paved through black neighborhoods. And I understand what a tragedy that was. So I get it. I know why they exist. And it's very hard for me to wrap my head around the tragedy that was the construction of the interstate highway system in cities, and how I feel about local control blocking these projects that would be so important for the greater good in the transit world. But yeah, we'll have to get to that another day.
Yeah, and I think that'll probably do it on this episode too. Appreciate everyone tuning in. I'm real glad Owen was able to come and visit and explore my system.
It was a great time.
Might have to do a parallel episode about Chicago's network. I don't have as much experience on that, but I'd love to dive on in. And this was kind of a new format for us. So if you have any cities or systems or regions that you'd like us to dig into kind of in depth like we did today, leave it in the comments. We'd love to hear. But on that note, any final assessments of Denver, any overarching things that you will be burning up in your chest if you don't get into this microphone?
No, I loved the city. It was a great first experience, and I'm so grateful that the system exists compared to not existing. We have little critiques. I'm sure there's things I got wrong. If you're an expert on Denver, please let me know in the comments. But while there's changes I'd love to see, the most important thing is that it exists. You can go to Denver and live without a car under the right circumstances, and that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and maybe in another episode we'll discuss another form of transit, the Denver airport. There's a lot to unpack there.
There is.
But until next time, you have touched the third rail. Thank you for tuning in, and have a good one.